All right, so the purpose of these notes is just to go through some of the bonding and water properties notes that we talked about in class and kind of finish these up. So I'm going to go over some of the bonding stuff in the beginning right now. Feel free to skip ahead to where we left off in the notes, wherever that was in our class, if you feel comfortable on the bonding stuff already. So as a reminder, we're going to be talking about molecules here. Molecules are two or more atoms together. So any group of atoms we call a molecule, water being a great example of that. And the reason we would talk about water is made up of two kinds of interesting bonds, one being the covalent bond and one being the hydrogen bond. And these bonds in water lead to some of water's really unique properties that we see here, okay? And so the hydrogen bond being the one that kind of leads to the properties that we can see with our eyes and what we would have seen in our water lab in class. This is technically not a bond in chemical standards. This is more like an intermolecular force. But for our class, we're going to call them bonds, all right? And these are the kinds of interactions we're going to see right here. So atoms bond. Why do they even do this in the first place? Well, the reason atoms bond is because they want to be stable. And so atoms are stable when their furthest layer or shell is filled or full with electrons. So in our carbon atom here, I went ahead in class and drew in these 4 green electrons to represent the second electron. But what you would notice is a standard carbon has 1, 2, 3, 4 electrons in its second shell or energy level. Now, this is not necessarily stable on its own because the maximum number of electrons that the second energy shell can hold, or second energy level, is 8. So in an ideal world, carbon would have each of its seats, and that's how I describe electrons, occupying what we call orbitals. That's beyond the scope of our class, but for right now, we just know that electrons occupy a space in these shells, and the maximum number of seats or electrons these levels can hold at the second level is 8. So when this atom has 8 electrons and all of its seats are filled, it's very stable. Okay, and so the reason why carbon might want to bond with something like hydrogen is because each of these bonds, which can be represented by lines or 2 circles, which are electrons, basically represent 2 shared electrons between the carbon and the hydrogen. And when we have 4 bonds, what happens is the molecule, or the carbon here, will now have 8 electrons in its second energy level, making it highly stable. Okay, so these 4 covalent bonds, which are nonpolar, make the carbon atom stable, and that's why atoms might want to participate in bonding. And so this pattern here, the fact that carbon can hold 8 electrons, is why we can draw 4 bonds around it if we follow our honk if you love biology rules that we talked about in class. Okay, so water is the most important inorganic molecule. Okay, it's inorganic because it has no carbon in it, and we'll talk about that later in the unit. But water is super, super important, and what makes it so special is due to the fact that it is a polar molecule. Now, what does polar mean? We talked about in class is if we had a tug-of-war scenario, and let's say that this group is an oxygen atom and this single guy is a hydrogen. What we would notice is in a polar covalent bond, the 2 atoms here are pulling on these electrons unevenly. So this group over here is like our oxygen because it pulls harder on the electrons than this hydrogen group over here. And so in a polar covalent bond, what we would expect to happen is a shared pair of electrons are shared unequally, like we would see in this tug of war here, as the rope would go towards the group of the 3 guys. Okay? And so in our examples, we talked about how this is different between a polar and a nonpolar bond. So in a nonpolar bond, our electrons are shared equally. So this would be like an even match in a tug of war, where the atoms involved in the bonds pull on the electrons evenly. What makes this nonpolar is, if you notice, compared to the polar pictures, we don't see these positive and negative signs on the atoms. These positive and negative signs, this is actually the Greek symbol for S or sigma here, undercase, and you'll see that this is a plus or a minus. These are what we call the poles, okay? So when you have a partially positive charge on one of your atoms, we call that a positive pole. And we have a partially negative charge on our negative atom, we call that a negative pole. So it's like kind of on the Earth, how we have a north and a south pole. On this molecule of water, we have a negative pole and a positive pole. You can also think of magnets and how magnets have positive and negative ends. We call those poles as well. And the reason we form these poles is because on the oxygen is pulling these electrons tighter to it and forming a negative charge around this atom, making that negative pole. The hydrogens, in contrast, are losing electrons to the oxygen, so the oxygen is holding on to them more strongly than the hydrogen and becoming slightly positive as a result. In nonpolar, if these are shared equally between, what we would expect to happen is neither atom develops a pole, and so we'd have no charges on the molecule. So in a nonpolar covalent bonds, these electrons are shared completely evenly, like you would see in this picture. Okay. So why does this happen in water in particular? Well, water is made of a few different atoms, that being oxygen and hydrogen. Now, oxygen we can describe as an electron hog. So in this picture over here, what we see is we see our oxygen pulling on these happy little electrons here, or these little hydrogens. And so what it's doing is it's grabbing the electrons with it in the bond. So the electrons, again, are shared in the bond. So what we would expect is we'd expect the oxygen to hold on to these electrons tighter. So looking at this molecule picture here, right, the reason this negative pole forms is because the oxygen's holding on to the electrons more tightly, hugging them in. And when you bring in negativity into your life, you know this from your real life experience, you become a little bit more negative yourself. And what that results in is a slightly negative charge on the oxygen. Okay? Now, again, as I said, this is due to the fact that these are covalent polar bonds. So these covalent bonds where the oxygen and hydrogen are sharing electrons, this is an uneven sharing. So this is back to our tug of war example. This is the group of three guys who are pulling really hard. And so these oxygens are pulling on the electrons really hard, bringing all these negative charges around it. And what that results in is a slightly negatively charged atom or pole. Okay? And then now the hydrogens, in contrast, are losing some of their negative charges or time spent with the negative charges, which makes them slightly positive. And so that forms our positive pole. Now, why is this important? This makes water what we call a polar molecule. And polar molecules like water can engage in what we call a hydrogen bond. So now, this is where we put it all together. What we see here are two water molecules. These two water molecules have covalent bonds between them. And each of these water molecules can form what we call a hydrogen bond between them. So remember, we have a slightly positive pole on the hydrogen of each water molecule and a slightly negative pole on the oxygen of each molecule. What that means is, as we know, opposites attract. So now each of these molecules becomes sticky to one another, where their hydrogens will face the oxygen of another molecule and engage in this weak intermolecular interaction called a hydrogen bond. So in this diagram, the solid lines like you're seeing here, those are your covalent bonds as they hold the atoms together. Okay, they're solid, they're strong, so they're drawn with solid lines. And these are between atoms of the same molecule. And hydrogen bonds, again, are between atoms of different molecules. So these hold different molecules close to one another in configuration. Okay, and so a hydrogen bond will always be between the hydrogen of one molecule and the oxygen of another molecule. Okay, and that's due to the positive and negative poles being slightly attracted to each other. Okay, so now why do we talk about hydrogen bonding in the first place? Okay, hydrogen bonding can bond to itself, and what that means is the water molecules within a water solution or a drop of water, the water molecules are sticky to one another because they're held together through hydrogen bonds. So on the surface level, what we can see happening is then we can see two properties of water. Well, one thing is we can see is like on a leaf, for example, you can see drops of water here. Water has the ability to stick to itself. So that's what we call cohesion. Water can stick to itself, and water is sticky, right? It's because each of the molecules, as we know, are held together through hydrogen bonds, so they can bead up and form like these drops of water, okay? So cohesion means it sticks to itself. Adhesion, water can hydrogen bond to other surfaces. So if you've ever like poured water out of a cup or out of a graduated cylinder, what you'll notice is that water sticks to the edge of things like a graduated cylinder. And it forms this bottom thing here. You'll learn about it in chemistry. We call that a meniscus. Okay, and so water can stick to the side of the plastic or glass graduated cylinders. And so H2O sticking to plastic is called adhesion. So when you hang something up in a room with like sticky tack or tape, you're sticking one substance to another. So the way I remember this is adhesion, adhesion, another. So another equals adhesion. So the two words that start with A, okay, sticking to another surface is adhesion, okay? An application of this, right, is here's a picture. What is wrong with this picture? So if you're watching with somebody else or in a lab group or watching on your own, take a second and see if you can find what's wrong with this picture. Okay, welcome back. So if you look here, this is a picture of two water molecules, and maybe what's wrong with this is the fact they have hands, which is a little creepy. But beyond that, what you notice is this hand holding right here. This is the cohesion we're seeing, right? Cohesion, or water molecules sticking to themselves, is caused by an hydrogen bond or an H bond, okay? Now, what we know about a hydrogen bond is if you go back up into the diagram, hydrogen bonds exist between the hydrogen of one molecule and the oxygen of another, okay? So in this picture, we have two oxygens holding hands. That should never work because if you remember, the water has a slightly positive charge on the hydrogen and a slightly negative charge on the oxygen. Those two poles should not interact, okay? So what's wrong with this picture? The oxygen should not be holding another oxygen. The oxygen should grab a hydrogen if we're trying to represent a hydrogen bond. Okay, that's what's wrong with this picture, okay? Now the adhesion portion is great. We're hydrogen bonding to another surface, and that's great, okay? All right, application of both these concepts, capillary action. So capillary action is the ability of water to move up against the force of gravity. So we can, in things like tree roots, this is the classic example, okay? So trees gather water from the soil in their roots, and what water can do is, if you ever think about this, this is quite an amazing thing that life can do because of water's unique polar properties. Since water can hydrogen bond, it can hydrogen bond to other surfaces, so like the inside of this trunk here of the plant, and it can travel up against gravity. So we can get water climbing hundreds of feet into the air all the way to the leaves of these trees because water, leaves, and cells need their water to survive, right? So the cells of the plant need this water. They depend on it. So the ability of water to move up against gravity is quite amazing. So water travels to the leaf against gravity. So if you ever wonder how that works, okay, this phenomenon is what we call capillary action, okay? The reason this works is because water can adhere, right, to the walls of plant, is adheres or adhesive, and it's able to stick to itself. So it stays together as one liquid, so water sticks to itself as well, so it's cohesive, allowing it to also travel up as like a group. Okay, and so it can travel up as one fluid liquid stream. So those two properties lead to water doing some amazing things. Okay. So again, we see this in like things like paper towels. Here we have red dyed water, and this red dyed water is moving against gravity. Okay. So we see that there. You can also see it in something like a skinny tube, which you would have seen in your lab. Again, the water is moving upwards against gravity, sticking to the glass, and moving as a cohesive unit. So that's called capillary action. Okay, water also has high surface tension. So if you've ever wondered how like bugs float on the surface of water, so these are things like water crawlers. Water crawlers can crawl across the surface of a water pond because of water being a high surface tension object. You've also maybe seen it when water domes above glass surfaces. So you would have seen it if we did the stacking water drops in the penny in the water lab, or generally if you like overflow a cup or something, you might get a little bit of a dome shape kind of occurring where the water domes. So the reason we have this is because of what's called surface tension. So if you imagine surface tension is the result of many strong hydrogen bonds in the surface. Okay, it's the result of many weak hydrogen bonds lead to surface tension. So these bonds are not that strong, right? But together they collectively have enough force to hold something up. Okay, so what you can imagine is if water molecules, each of these are waters, so this is like an H2O here, and so is this. These hydrogen bonds form almost like a film on the surface of the water. Okay, and that film allows, right, objects to kind of sit on top of it like the water crawler and hold it up, almost like a trampoline. So here's another like visual image of how surface tension can work, right? Gravity works against things on top of water, but what the surface tension does is the surface tension pushes up. And so the surface tension pushes up against the force of gravity. Okay. Holding things and creatures up. So this little lizard here can actually run across the water. And the reason is because of the surface tension of the water, right? It forms that little film below the creature, and that film of water is pushing upwards as the creature runs across it. So it has a high surface area pads on its feet as well, and that helps distribute its weight across the water, allowing it to run across the surface. Okay. Now, there's also another really important property of water besides the surface tension idea. So we can have creatures living on top of water surfaces like bugs. We have things like plants possible because of capillary action bringing water up to the leaves and higher parts of plants. We also have a really important property of water, that ice floats. So solid water floats. Why is this important? Well, that leads to things like glaciers in the Arctic, right? We have animals and ecosystems that live on top of these, like polar bears and penguins, okay? Right? And so ice like this is low density. So when something is low density, it floats on top. The water is higher density. So that allows things like glaciers to form on top of this stuff. So why is this the case? Well, density is equal to mass over volume. Okay, and what we notice is that in an ice form, the water molecules here form this almost hexagonal pattern. And so what we would say is this hexagonal shape that you're seeing here, where these water molecules spread out and are held in place by their hydrogen bonds, this leads to a very high volume. So if you've ever like frozen a water bottle, the water bottle expands because ice has a greater volume than liquid water. So if I increase my volume down here, right, what you would notice is if I increase volume and keep my mass the same, so let's say I have like 10 grams or something, right, that should decrease my density because I'm dividing by a smaller number. Okay, so the density of ice is low. Okay, now versus if I look at liquid water, these occupy and don't spread out as much. So this is not in the lattice-like structure, this hexagon structure that the ice has, okay? And so what this does is this has low volume. So if you have the same amount of mass in a lower amount of volume, the density is higher. And that's why liquid water is more dense than ice, okay? And so the spreading out of the hydrogen bonds in ice structure, that's what makes ice crystals crystals, is because of the way that these lattice hexagon shapes form in ice. So why is this important? Well, if ice sank to the bottom of bodies of water, think about like a lake in the winter. If ice sank to the bottom and froze at the bottom, what would happen is the water above it would start to freeze as well. And the whole lake would freeze from bottom to top. So organisms like fish, frogs, and other things that live under ice sheets that actually typically have liquid water under them during the winter, those organisms would die, right? Because now they don't have that insulating effect of the ice layer on top, and the ice would be frozen solid to the top, okay? So there's my example of a frozen ice water bottle where it expands out, okay? So the frozen water kind of expands the water bottle out like that, okay? Now, last few things that we're going to talk about is water is what we call a powerful solvent. So it's able to dissolve a lot of different types of things, which allow us to have things like cells with many different substances in them, because water is inside our cells, it's inside our body, our blood and other fluids are made of water. So water is a polar solvent that is universal, meaning it dissolves a lot of different things. So the rule that we use in this class is like dissolves like. So like dissolves like means that polar liquids can dissolve charged and charged ionic and polar substances. So there should be a comma there, okay? And so what that means is if I put something like an ion, right, into water. So what we'd see is water here. I can put something like salt into water. So solute is what you dissolve into a liquid. The solvent is what you put the liquid into. So the solvent is what you dissolve into. It's usually a liquid. Solute is what you put in. So if I were to put in what we call an ionic solute, which is basically something that splits into ions, this over here is our water. What we have over here is a plus and minus ions. So these are our ions. So ions have charges. They're atoms with charges. And so a negative ion and a positive ion can both dissolve in water. So take a minute to think why that's the case. Okay, so knowing what we know, water is slightly negative on the oxygen pole and slightly positive on the hydrogen pole. Okay, and so positively charged ions, which is in something like table salt, can be dissolved by water because the negative, right, the slightly negatively charged oxygen can attract the positive charged ions. Same thing goes for the negative ion. The positive charged hydrogens over here can face the negative charge, what we call anion, the negative ion. Okay, so water can dissolve something like an ionic solid because of the hydrogen pole bonds interaction with these ions. Okay. Now, water can't dissolve everything. Water can dissolve things with charges or polar things that have slightly positive or negative charges, but it can't dissolve things without charges. So something that's nonpolar has no charge. So there's no poles, has no charges. So that'd be something like oil. So if you've ever put oil and water together, they form two layers because the oil layer has no charges and the polar layer has all these charges in here. So remember, the oxygens are slightly negative, the hydrogens are slightly positive. So these guys don't want to interact, or rather, their charges kind of exclude the nonpolar, non-charged things because like dissolves like. So again, polar substances cannot dissolve nonpolar things like oils. Okay, for that reason. So the charged things are kind of like a clique. They're like, they don't want to associate with nonpolar or different things, because polar things have charges, so they're more stable, bonding to each other. All right, so the last thing we're going to go over is specific heat. Okay, so specific heat is a thing you'll talk about a lot more in chemistry, but specific heat is the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of something. Okay, so generally speaking, temperature is how fast particles are moving, and so high specific heat means it takes a lot of energy to raise the temperature of a liquid. Water has a very high specific heat, okay? And so the reason water has a very high specific heat is because of the fact that it has hydrogen bonds within it. So all these properties are due to the fact that water has hydrogen bonds, okay? So the reason water could dissolve ions is because it has these hydrogen bonds with one another forming positive and negative poles. So it can dissolve things with charges. Water has high specific heat because of the hydrogen bonds it has. So if I go to the simulation here, I'm going to show you what boiling water looks like. Okay, so if you go back to, we saw this in our lab. Okay, so if I go here and I look at something like water, water has its hydrogen bonds between it, so that's what's holding these molecules together. It takes a lot of heat to get these water molecules moving, because in order to separate them and raise its temperature, which is the speed of particles, right, it takes a lot of energy to break those hydrogen bonds first and then get them moving faster. So that's why something like water takes a long time to raise its temperature. Now, if I look at Lake Michigan, this is a great example of this. The lake is pretty cold even into June and July if you've ever swam in Lake Michigan. And the reason is because water takes a lot of time to raise its temperature as a very high specific heat. That's good for life because organisms living in the ocean or lakes like fish and turtles and whatnot, okay, they like to live in stable temperatures, right? They want to maintain internal conditions that are stable. That's that homeostasis we talked about at the beginning of the year. So if things live in water and use water to survive, it's great that it takes a long time to raise its temperature so that we can go ahead and make sure that life living in water and the water that we have on Earth doesn't evaporate or raise its temperature too quickly. Okay, and the last thing is that water has this high heat of vaporization as well. So water on Earth doesn't dry up really quickly, even when it gets hot in the summer, because it takes a lot of energy to evaporate. And so that leads to some interesting things like evaporative cooling, where our sweat, when water evaporates into gas, right? So we sweat, and that turns into gas that releases and cools us, and as heat dissipates from our body. Okay, so those are the properties of water that I want you guys to take a look at. Again, all of these are due to hydrogen bonding. Hopefully this was helpful. Thanks.